I remember the sound of rain on the terrace the night she smiled at me as the house tilted. The hand that had once fit mine like two halves of a broken coin became the instrument that broke me. They said I'd walked off the roof. She told them I had chosen the dark. The funeral was a theater, flowers, condolences, the hum of pity she fed on like sunlight. I watched from a place no one could see, the words she whispered to the carpets like prayers to another life. Then breath. Not the ragged finality of death, but the slow, impossible re-entry into a morning that smelled of lemon and laundry, the morning my second life began. I sat up in my old bed and felt the memory of the fall like a scar beneath my ribs and the taste of betrayal as sharp as copper. The clock read the same minute the argument had started. Outside, the world was unchanged. Inside me, everything was rearranged. When she came in humming about the charity brunch she'd skip for a spa day, innocent sacrifices she'd wear like medals, she paused at my doorway. Her eyes found mine, and for the first time she saw fear where there should have been compliance. I answered with the smile I'd kept in reserve. "Yes," I said. She believed I'd been saved by chance, by miracle, a narrative that suited her. The house tilted back into its old rhythms, her lipstick by the sink, her laugh like glassware, the way her fingers tapped schedules into my phone as if my body were only a resource. I let her think I was the man who forgave. I learned how to be gentle and slow and unthreatening, the way you lull a sleeping animal before you stitch its wound. At the office she found a new cause, a charity for mothers who'd been taken advantage of by unscrupulous relatives. It was perfect, noble, public, and an elegant excuse to burn herself out in appearances and meetings while everyone praised her saintliness. I answered every invitation she sent me with a warmth so practiced it became real. I held her hand at galas, letting the cameras see us as one. Behind closed doors, I fed the idea of sacrifice like a plant that would grow crooked and fruitless. That night I cataloged each of her ailments, the small cough she ignored, the missing hours of sleep she laughed away, the medication she skipped because the family demanded more from her than she had to give. I pretended to be the man who'd keep her safe, and in that pretense placed the first stone of her ruin. She loved to save people, or at least to look saving them. Her mother came back into town with demands disguised in old resentments. Her sister called needing loans dressed up as emergencies. The family leaned on her like wind on a lean house. I watched her agree to everything, watched her shoulders slope like a ship taking on water. At dinner she told me about a conference that would require months away and a presentation that might change the charity's profile forever. It was her currency. The more she gave, the richer she looked. I could have argued, called her on the toll it would take, warned her gently. Instead, I kissed the hollow of her throat and said yes again. I applauded the hero in the mirror. When she packed, her suitcase was full of ambition and a silence where our conversation used to live. Alone, I fanned the embers of the family's expectations, private messages about gratitude, veiled praise that implied she was the only one who could keep the fragile story together. I whispered support to the world on her behalf. Let them need her, I thought. Let them take. That night she tucked a note into my hand, the kind of note people keep like talismans. "Thank you for always understanding," it read. My eyes slid to the staircase where once she'd pushed me. My fingers closed around the paper until the edges bit into my palm. There was one thing she wanted above applause, the perfect body of a woman who could command rooms without apology. She envied faces in magazines as if they were medals for a life well bled. A specialist offered a new treatment, promising, expensive, risky if her heart was taxed. The doctor's brochure was glossy and precise. The testimonials were a chorus. Her pulse quickened just reading it. She asked me, wide-eyed and trembling, whether I supported it. It would take months of procedures and strict regimens. It would swallow time and money and demand a vigor she didn't possess. The family would laud her bravery for enduring it. I could have refused in the name of caution, could have reminded her about pallid checkups and whispered concerns the way a husband should. Instead, I took her hand and told her I was proud of her courage. "Do it," I said. "You deserve to feel like that." She kissed me like gratitude was oxygen. At night, as machines hummed in the hospital and nurses checked her vitals, I sat quietly beside her bed and learned to read the fine tremor in her wrist, the one that could unravel everything. I read every report, cataloged every risk, and then I smiled and arranged the next appointment. Revenge is a mosaic of small tiles. I broke her days into tiny fractures. A missed call left unreturned that would have canceled an appointment. A gentle misdirection about the right dosage on a supplement she insisted would speed recovery. I learned to speak with the authority of someone who cares, the kind of authority that lets people make the wrong choices believing they're led by love. At a family brunch, I complimented her strength loudly. "You can handle the extra work," I said, pulling a phrase she'd been told until she believed it. Her face brightened. She accepted more tasks with that same hungry, thankful smile. I made sure she was booked solid for weeks, back-to-back meetings, late-night charity calls, all the small mortifications that pile into exhaustion. She started losing weight, not from diet but from depletion. Her hands shook when she hung up the phone. She joked about it. "It's just busy season," she lied. One morning, I found an envelope in her purse, a letter from the specialist recommending a supplementary regimen that required strict rest. She folded it into the pocket of her coat and left it there. I left it there, too. It was a night of small collapses. The family sent a text that needed consoling. The charity coordinator demanded an emergency call. Two calls that could have been spaced out collided into a single impossible evening. She answered them both. She soothed, she promised. She booked a meeting for dawn. The cup of tea she always made for herself sat untouched as she talked, voice threaded with thin patience. I watched her in the doorway, eyelids heavy and jaw clenched. I poured her tea and let it cool on her nightstand. When she finally folded into the bed, she slept with one eye open as if the world owed her vigilance. At 3 a.m., a faint wheeze cut the night, a sound I had fileboxed in memory from another life. I held her until it passed, my hands steady as if saving her were all I ever wanted. The doctor's note the next day read like an ordinary admonition: reduce stress, monitor heart, give rest. She smiled and promised to adjust. Then she went to a meeting where applause awaited. I watched her leave and my mouth tasted of iron. I sent a care note to the charity board, praising her dedication in language calculated to elevate her, to make her indispensable. They thanked her publicly, and she took the praise like a drug. Media started to orbit her. Profiles, interviews, a short documentary praising her tireless devotion. Each appearance was another notch on the pedestal, but pedestals are built of distance, not support. She ate less. She smiled more. The specialists cheered the progress of the treatment she'd chosen. Her calendar swelled with panels and inaugurations. Physical tests that once suggested caution were downplayed in the excitement of headlines. "She's a force," people said. "She's unstoppable." I arranged logistics, smiling while I booked flights that included long layovers and strenuous schedules. I arranged for extra staff, for makeup artists who worked late, for vehicles that would get her to cameras on time. She began to measure herself by the number of people who needed her. She equated being indispensable with being loved. Each ovation tightened the wire around her chest. One evening, after a gala where she'd laughed until tears of fatigue glazed her lashes, she leaned into my shoulder and whispered, "What if I can't keep up?" I kissed her temple and said, with deceptive conviction, "Then we rest." But in the plan I was writing in my head, there would be no rest for her, not until the thing she loved most had eaten her from the inside. Her family's requests turned into demands. A cousin's business failed. An aunt needed legal fees. Her mother wanted a remodeled room to keep a grandchild's toys. Each plea was wrapped in history and guilt, and she unwrapped them all with the fever of someone determined to be indispensable. I began forwarding messages with tiny affirmations. "She can do it. This is her gift." I never told them when she'd had a bad night. I never mentioned the fatigue in her eyes. When a distant relative died and the funeral fell on the same weekend as a crucial treatment, she chose the funeral. She grieved publicly, and then, without sleep, she went straight into an early morning procedure to check on progress. The doctors frowned at the fatigue on her chart, but noted the clinical results were within acceptable limits. I sat by her through both rituals, a muted vigil at a wake, then the sterile lights of a clinic, and learned the rhythms of an exhausted body. Her mother kissed her forehead and called her brave. The family called her a rock. I helped them build that image brick by brick. The charity's funding soared. Donors sent letters, reporters queued. She became a symbol, one woman's sacrifice for the many. But symbols have no pulse, and people who become symbols sometimes forget they are still flesh. The specialist's last note said in careful terms, "Proceed with great caution." She read it at the breakfast table and smiled with a thinness I could feel like a winter wind. "They need me," she said. "This work can't wait." I elevated her story in conversations, let it echo to the ears of those who mattered. I assured sponsors of her stamina. I scheduled one more televised appeal that would cement her legacy and possibly bring the last, largest donor. The night before the broadcast, she packed her bag with pills labeled for travel and a folder of talking points. Her hands trembled while she rehearsed lines about duty and love for the underserved. She looked at me as if asking permission. I gave it. On the stage, under lights that felt like sun on a fevered brow, she spoke beautifully. Cameras caught each heartfelt pause. In the wings, a nurse offered water and an aide checked her blood pressure discreetly, high but dismissed with a smile. She finished to a standing ovation. Backstage, someone proposed a celebratory dinner. She accepted. Her smile that night was the kind that masks ruin beneath glitter. The first time she fainted, everyone called it exhaustion. The second time, the paramedics smiled and caught her before she hit the floor. At home, nights were shorter and breaths more labored. At the clinic, tests returned results shaded with concern. I recorded them privately, the way a collector files away evidence, and then I erased the more urgent notes from my voicemail replies to relatives who worried. I learned which phrases calmed them and which ones roused suspicion. "She's fine," I told them over and over. One morning she woke with a bruise on her arm and no memory of how she'd fallen in the bathroom. She joked, embarrassed, and we laughed around it the way people do when something fragile needs to stay whole. But that night alone, she opened her laptop and skimmed through messages that suggested more rounds of treatment, riskier, more invasive, with faster results and a steeper cost. Her eyes, once sharp with ambition, dulled with the calculus of what she owed everyone. She closed the laptop without telling me. I wanted her to rest. I wanted her to step back. But in the ledger I kept in my head, there were columns for debt and gratitude and the crowd's need. I fed the crowd. Their hunger would finish what I had begun. They began to whisper about a biography. A producer wanted to film her story, the sacrifices, the triumphs, the woman who gave until empty. It would dramatize everything she'd endured and would be seen by millions. The project promised perfection but demanded a grueling schedule to capture authenticity. Each on-camera reenactment would require her to retell trauma and relive faint edges of panic. She read the contract, and with hands that shivered, signed. I watched the ink dry, and tasted a bitterness I would not admit to myself. Filming was an assault of sentiment and late-night shoots. They wanted the tear that had fallen on the conference stage, the anxious call from the mother, the silent night in the hospital. She obliged because for her, vulnerability was currency. I coached her on how to emote in ways that would collect sympathy without raising alarms. I held her when the cameras were off and let her rest in my arms, then nudged her toward the next scene. The crew asked for more authenticity, more endurance. She gave it. On the drive home after a 12-hour day, she coughed and pressed a hand to her chest as the world slid past in blurs of neon. She looked at me like a child who'd lost her way. "I can't keep doing this," she said. I kissed her forehead and murmured, "Just a little more." The doctor's handwriting became more urgent. I sat with the reports and considered the power of a withheld word. If I told her everything, the real risk, the specific prognosis, she might step back. She might choose herself over applause. So each night I selected safer-sounding phrases and texted them to her mother, to her team, to the producers. "She's improving, taking it at her own pace, all under control." I created a soft fog of optimism that obscured the jagged truths. She planned a grand fundraising gala to culminate the film's release, a night that would sell the idea of her as unbreakable. I put my hand in hers as she rehearsed the speech and pressed a line of encouragement into the hollow of her palm. "The world needs you," I said. She smiled and believed it. That night she fell asleep in the chair, eyelids heavy as curtains. I covered her with a blanket and went to make a phone call I pretended was for logistics, but in truth arranged yet another engagement in 3 days' time. Another thread to tug when she might have wanted to rest. She began to ask questions that cut toward the heart of things. Do they really need me more than I need myself? Have I been using love to excuse my exhaustion? I answered with a practiced tenderness, the kind that let her believe she was being heard while steering her away from decisions that would remove her from the stage. I'd grown intimate with the map of her weaknesses. I learned which roads would keep her in motion and which would lead her to stop. 2 nights before the gala's final rehearsal, she woke gasping. The sound was a knife. In the they hooked her to monitors and spoke in brisk clinical sentences. The doctor gave a list of interventions and a note of caution I had heard before. Alone with her, the fluorescent lights bleaching the room, she took my hand. "If I step back, will they forget the work?" she asked. I held her harder and said, truth in lie, "They won't, but they might need you less." Her grip slackened. She believed me because I had made the world tell the same lie for months. When she slept, I thought of the other life, of stares and betrayal and a push that had been literal. Now I pushed with kindness, 1,000 small permissions that nudged her into harm. I told myself it was justice for what she had done. I told myself it was love. The gala was a constellation. The city's glitter turned the hall into a shallow sea. Cameras were stars. Her speech cut through the room and landed on those who'd been moved by her image. Tears, applause, contract offers. The film's premiere would follow. The producer whispered of awards. She stood taller than she had in months, but fragile like glass warmed in the sun, brilliant, likely to crack. Halfway through the night, after a standing ovation and a cascade of congratulations, she felt dizzy. She blamed fatigue and laughed it off, but her fingers trembled when she raised her glass. I guided her to a chair, murmuring comfort while inwardly cataloging reactions. The doctor who had treated her earlier was in attendance. I caught his eye and offered a warm, confident shrug that said everything was fine. He smiled at me, and in that instant the fiction we'd cultivated seemed real. Later, upstairs in our quiet room, she collapsed into sleep that was not restorative. When the dawn light threaded the curtains, she reached for the phone to answer an urgent message from a sponsor about an overseas appearance. Her lips formed the word yes before the rest of her mind could object. The creak on the staircase sounded like a prelude. The plane lifted her into a sky that smelled of new promises. I had arranged travel, met schedules, silenced concerns with confident words. The producer wanted one last scene of authenticity, a volunteer visit to an underfunded clinic in a town whose roads wore the honest dust of neglect. It was perfect theater, the heroine among the people she saved. It was also remote, with a clinic whose staff ran lean and whose nearest hospital was hours away. She accepted. I kissed her goodbye like a benediction, and she left with that certain, luminous smile that had once been my reason and had become my method. Hours into the visit, she pushed herself through an extra shift, insisting on hearing every story, every need. A nearby child's emergency demanded immediate attention. She rushed to the doorway to help coordinate a transfer. Her breath that had been weathered by months of small violences failed her with a quietness that left no room for dramatic rescue. The clinic's radio crackled with delay. The nearest ambulance had left on another call. She sank against the corrugated wall, eyes wide not with accusation, but with the shock of someone who'd been told all her life that giving is the point of living. I stood at the edge of the town's small road, watching the dust settle around the clinic like a slow exhale. In another life, I'd been the protector who pulled her from a flight of stairs. In this life, I had been the builder of the scaffold she climbed. I had lit the stage, tuned the audience, and taught them all to need her. As the sun slid under the horizon, a pale cab pulled up and the clinic staff called for help. My phone buzzed, a brief clinical message. She had collapsed. I read the words and felt no triumph, only an ache like a seam splitting. Justice and vengeance are heavy things. They don't settle like trophies. They weigh on the chest. She smiled at me in my memory as the light went out. I thought of the first night, of the push down the stairs, of the rumor she had spun. I knew then that survival had been a second chance not to return to being the protector, but to remake fate itself. The lesson was sharp. Some constructions take more than one life to build, and sometimes the builder must walk away to let them fall. Outside, the road was empty and the stars were indifferent. Inside, a single candle burned down to a nub. The next breath I took tasted faintly of ash. The phone call came 3 days later. They had revived her. The words hung in the air like fragile birds. Revived, not returned, merely reclaimed. She lay in a hospital bed hundreds of miles away, connected to tubes and gentle machines that breathed for her. I flew out, sitting by the window of the plane like a ghost chasing its own echo. The sky looked identical to the day she left, endless, merciless blue. The world did not care that we had broken each other. When I saw her again, she was pale as paper, but the steady rise and fall of her chest anchored the moment. The doctors spoke in cautious optimism. Temporary heart failure, possible recovery, long rehabilitation. I took her hand, the same hand that had once betrayed me, the same hand I'd guided toward ruin, and felt warmth return, slow and uncertain. "Why did you come?" she whispered when her eyes fluttered open. I wanted to say revenge, but the word died somewhere between heartbeats. What escaped was softer, because I remembered who we were before all of this. She blinked at me. Confusion, pain, and something small and human flickered through the fog. Outside, rain began to fall again, the same rain that had marked both our endings. This time, it sounded like forgiveness trying to find its way in. Recovery was slow. Each day she learned to breathe on her own again. Each day I stayed. I fetched water, argued with doctors, helped her sit up when her body refused to obey. Her family came, all tears and apologies, realizing too late how much they had taken. I said nothing. The architect of downfall had nothing left to build, only to unbuild. She began to remember small flashes of what she had done, what I had done in return. Guilt rippled between us like heat. One morning she turned her face toward the window and said, "You wanted me to break." "Yes," I admitted, "and you broke me first." Silence stretched, not cruel, not cold, but full of the weight of everything unsaid. Finally she spoke again. Then maybe we both needed to shatter to see what was underneath. She reached out, fingers trembling, and I took her hand. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love reborn. It was something simpler. Two ruins holding each other steady long enough to breathe. In the hospital garden, flowers bloomed in crooked lines, imperfect, persistent. We walked there each afternoon, saying little, learning again what quiet meant when it wasn't made of rage. The past didn't vanish, but for the first time, it felt like something we could walk beside instead of under. Months passed. The charity continued without her, but this time under new leadership, volunteers who didn't demand her life to keep it alive. She sent guidance from afar, her voice calmer, her smile no longer hollow. We sold the old house, the one with the stairs that remembered too much, and moved into a small seaside cottage where the windows stayed open. The air smelled of salt and new beginnings. One evening, we stood watching the sunset pour gold across the waves. She turned to me and said, "Do you think we can ever make peace with what we were?" I thought about it. About lives lived twice, about vengeance mistaken for closure, about how fragile redemption really is. "I think peace isn't what we make," I said. "It's what we stop destroying." She smiled, faint, tired, real. The light touched her face, and for the first time, I didn't see the woman who betrayed me or the one I punished. I saw someone human, flawed, finite, and still standing. The tide came in slowly, whispering against the shore like an old friend returning. I reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. The sun slipped beneath the horizon, and for the first time in 2 lives, the darkness didn't feel like an ending. In this one, I finally learned how to forgive us both.